Welcome to your Digital Mentor podcast. I am Alice Matimba from Welcome Connecting Science, and I'll be your host today. So today we will have a conversation about grants and fundraising for research, a very topical issue for a lot of researchers. And our guests are Jennifer Gardy from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in the United States, and Nicki Tiffin, who's based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So before we start, we're just going to invite you to tell us more about yourselves, and then we'll get straight into the discussion. So if you could just introduce yourself, Nicki.
Thanks, Alice. So I'm Nicki Tiffin. I work at the University of Cape Town, and I'll soon be moving to the South African National Bioinformatics Institute at the University of the Western Cape. I'm originally a Zimbabwean. I worked in molecular genetics. I did my PhD in molecular genetics. And then I did research in bioinformatics. I studied for a master's in public health and epidemiology. So I also work some of my time in the public health sector, and I work in research at the point of integrating data from all these different domains.
And Jennifer, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me today. This is going to be really exciting. My name is Jennifer Gardy. I'm Deputy Director for Surveillance Data and Epidemiology on the malaria team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And what that job entails is leading our strategy and our investments in three aspects of malaria. The first is improving routine surveillance data and data quality within national malaria control programs. The second is using genetic and genomic data, both from the parasite and the vector, as a new data type to tell us more about malaria epidemiology. And the third part of what my team does is invest in the use of geospatial and mathematical models to help countries understand their malaria epidemiology and potential control measures. I've been with the foundation for coming up on 3 years now. And before that, I was in academia. I was the Canada Research Chair in Public Health Genomics at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And my lab was based at the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. And there I spent a lot of time working in an area actually very similar to Nicki, using molecular genetics, genomics approaches as a tool to answer questions about disease transmission and public health.
So I'm quite interested in your career path. And I think both of you expressed how your career paths have been non-linear. So you've dabbled in this and that. Jennifer, you've obviously worked as a researcher and you were funded by grants, and now you're a funder. And Nicki, you've gone from academia to public health services to research and all sorts. And I'm just interested in what was the reason for this? How did, for example, funding, or availability of grants affect your career choices, if at all, so that you would dabble in this and that and kind of like have a roundabout path? Especially, I was very interested in Jennifer's path as well. So Jennifer, did funding or availability of funding affect your career choices?
It wasn't so much the availability of funding as it was the fact that I found academia and the constant race for funding to be a real stressor. When you're working as an academic and you are reliant on grant funding, whether that is a career award, I had an endowed research chair, or whether it's just funding to keep hiring graduate students and do the work that you want to do, it's really stressful. You are constantly on. You're always thinking of, well, what grant could I be writing? What grant should I be writing? How am I going to stay relevant 5 years from now? How is my work still going to be really cutting leading edge, 10, 15 years from now? And I really didn't like the fact that funding was always like a sword of Damocles hanging over your head. So for me, it wasn't so much the availability. I was generally fairly lucky in getting the grants that I'd applied for, and my lab was well funded. But I just didn't like the process. I didn't like always being in that rat race. Because as I said, you never could turn off, even if it was a holiday break, a Christmas break, a university closure for a couple of weeks. You kept always thinking, gosh, I could or should be writing this paper. I could or should be writing this grant. how am I going to stay relevant? So for me, the switch from a fundee to a funder was really all about removing that stress and moving into an environment where the pace of my work is much different. My to-do list can be completed in the space of a day or a week. I mean, yes, my ultimate goal and the goal of our malaria team at the Gates Foundation is malaria eradication, and that's a marathon. But the steps to get there day to day, I can cross things off my to-do list. And for example, when I leave for vacation, I can close my laptop and not be worried, not be thinking like, oh, I should be working on this. And, I think the other thing about having a career path that dabbled, I really feel like I had a quite interdisciplinary research career. Yes, the major focus was on using pathogen genomics as a tool within public health, but it incorporated everything from information visualization, network analysis, social network analysis, ethics and governance issues of genomics in public health. And I also did a lot of science communication work just on the side, independent of my research career. And I feel like all of those things together not only gave me a more interesting and fulsome research career when I was in academia, but it really prepared me for a role like I have at the Gates Foundation, where, yes, our job is strategy and investment in global health and global health research, but there's so much more to that. It's a lot about bringing people together, bringing different interdisciplinary teams together, looking to other domains outside of malaria, outside of global health for solutions. So having dabbled in a range of areas over the course of my academic life, I think also helped position me for success in this current, much more enjoyable and less stressful career.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I guess, like you said, it's if you can't handle the stress, you always then try to find something that you can handle. Let's hear from Nicki. So you've obviously been, you're almost sitting in many rooms at the moment. So and that should be interesting for you. How do you find the funding environment? So, for example, when you're in the academic sphere and when you're in the public health services environment, how does that work for you? Do you see, are there differences, and what do you prefer, for example?
Thanks, Alice. I can absolutely relate to Jennifer talking about the stress of always chasing the next grant and chasing the next funding source. And I think my own sort of changes and switching around in my career is entirely attributable to scarcity of funding. I did a postdoc at UCSF when I was still a laboratory scientist. And then I was moving to South Africa, and I realized that I wouldn't have the same fridge full of reagents in the corridor, and I wouldn't have the same access to consumables as I'd been used to. And that was a point at which I decided to switch into bioinformatics and to get my computational biology skills going, because I felt that would be less reliant on getting funding to do lab research once I was in South Africa. So that was a pragmatic decision. I mean, I absolutely took to bioinformatics and computational biology, and I didn't look back. I've not been in a lab since, and I really can't pretend either to miss it very much. But then I also, having been in bioinformatics all on soft funding and soft funded posts, I realized that there were quite limited career choices for me. So at that point, in order to broaden my kind of opportunities for secure employment, I started my MPH, which I did part-time while I was leading a research group in bioinformatics. So it was also a pragmatic choice to make sure that I didn't get caught short, but it really stood me in good stead, and it completely changed the way I've viewed my research ever since having completed it. And then finally, I was in the research sector, and I was again funded on a grant that came to an end, and there was a delay in the grant renewal, and my salary dried up. So I had to jump ship quite quickly. And with my MPH behind me, I got a post working in the local health services, building a health information exchange. So I did jump ship, and it was a pragmatic choice, again, based on opportunity and also being a bit fed up with research and just wanting to get out of that trap. But again, it was absolutely a mind-expanding experience and a fantastic experience. I spent 3 years full-time in the health services and came back to academia not entirely convinced it was the right place for me. But then I was very lucky to be able to negotiate a space at the kind of intersection of the computational biology, the health service data and health informatics, as well as the epidemiology and the public health research. So actually my meandering path has brought me to a space where I can indulge in all of these interests. I consider myself very, very lucky to be able to do that. But all the choices were pushes because I didn't have secure funding. And I'm just very, very lucky that they all turned out to be really great choices for me.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. It seems like, you're always taking the pragmatic choices all the time. That's quite interesting. I'm interested in, where do grants come from? So where does the funding come from? So obviously people like Nicki get to be awarded grants and they get to use the funds. But I'm interested, Jennifer, how do you fundraise? Where do you get, where does that money come from? And how do you actually do the fundraising? And how do you decide that this is the theme we're going to fund? Who decides that and why? So I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a very unique donor in terms of the donor landscape. I think many listeners out there who are working in the academic landscape will be familiar with national funding bodies, whether it's something like Wellcome Trust, National Institutes of Health in the U.S. I received funding from places like Canadian Institutes for Health Research, Genome British Columbia, Genome Canada. Those tend to be taxpayer-funded, they're government-funded initiatives, and they run a fairly traditional funding program where you'll typically have open competitions. Sometimes there will be a particular target area, but generally they're fairly open. And people might be applying for a career award. This could be a scholarship or a fellowship early in the career. It could be a chair award later in their career, or some sort of open research award, funding to do a specific project or proposal. But a place like the Gates Foundation is extremely different. First of all, we are a private philanthropy. Our money comes from our co-chairs and trustees, Bill and Melinda themselves, Warren Buffett as well. And so the endowment itself is very different, and the way we distribute those funds are very different too. So the foundation, Bill and Melinda and Warren, is no longer a co-chair and trustee, but was instrumental in helping shape the foundation's direction early on. They said early on, we are going to find the niche that we as a donor are best positioned to fill. The donor landscape is incredibly diverse. Some agencies specialize in funding very applied upstream basic research. Some entities want to focus solely on capacity building. So for the Gates Foundation, it was figuring out where in that constellation of donors we fit, where our money is best used. So we invest largely in the global health and development space. We do have some other programs related to education in the United States and the Pacific Northwest community where the foundation's head office is located. But most people know us as a global health and development organization. We don't do all global health and development, though. We have very specific program areas that we focus on, and we call these program strategies. The number fluctuates as strategies sort of are added and taken away because we are very agile. We adapt over time. But on average, there's sort of 38, 39-ish strategies. Malaria, for example, is one of those strategies within the global health program. So there are areas that we focus on via strategies and areas that we don't. Then within a strategy, we only focus on investing in a specific number of domains. So in the malaria space, for example, as I said off the top, my portfolio focuses on things like improving routine surveillance, doing genetic and genomic work, doing geospatial and math modeling. And we've got a number of other portfolios in malaria that also have sort of similarly discrete foci. But we don't invest in everything in malaria. We are very, very focused, and there's very specific areas that we're interested in. And those often, about every 5 years, an individual team at the foundation will stop and review its strategy. So essentially what we do every time we write one of these strategies, which is basically the roadmap to how we invest, we sit down and we say, okay, what's the ultimate goal of our particular program strategy team on malaria? That is malaria eradication, zero malaria worldwide in our lifetime. And then we say, well, what needs to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in spaces like R&D, in spaces like epidemiology, in places like delivery and implementation science, and even policy and advocacy and global financing. We sit down and we say, what needs to happen and which of those things are we as the foundation best positioned to fund? And that really kind of creates our roadmap. So rather than run open competitions like, Wellcome or NIH or CHR might do, we really go out and find the teams that are best positioned to execute on the strategic vision that we as the foundation have laid out. So, for example, a big focus on my team right now is ensuring that labs across sub-Saharan Africa are equipped to do genetic, genomic, and the accompanying bioinformatics work to be able to answer questions in malaria. So we are going out, we are finding those labs, talking to them about what they feel is the most important work to do in their country, and we're funding that work. So it's a very, very different approach. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about taking that endowment from Bill, from Melinda, from Warren, and spending it in the most targeted way to achieve impact.
Wow, that's really quite specific. And I think obviously that makes you one of the biggest sort of global health funders, which is quite great, especially if you go out and you identify where do you fit? What's the best strategy to achieve A, B, C, D in the next 5 years? So that's quite a nice way to put it across. So Nicki, when you are writing these, when you're doing all this, looking for funding, which is I think you're now an expert in, what are some of the key skills for you to get there or to get the grants? What are some of those skills that you've either developed or you've learned, along the way that make it successful?
That's a great question, Alice, and I will give you quite an honest answer, which is maybe not what your audience are expecting to hear. I don't think it's that there's a clear set of rules, what you can do to be successful or not in grant writing. So I feel like there is an element of luck. It's like a lottery. And to enter the lottery, you have to write a scientifically first-class application. So to be in the lottery, your application has to be fabulous. You're not in the game if you've written something that's not scientifically really great and that has all the elements that are required. But I do think once you've done that and you've submitted, it seems to me a lottery as to who gets funded or not. And it often feels like quite an unfair lottery. That's my experience. So how did I learn to write grants? I learned to read the rejection letters and the reviewers' criticisms in great depth to understand what reviewers really don't want to see. So I now know that regardless of the statistical validity, you always put a sample size calculation in your grants. It doesn't matter whether it's needed or not, but if it's not there, it's going to be an issue, for example. So these are little things that you learn along the way, what people want to see, what reviewers want to see. And I guess my other comment, I think, is that reviewers are relatively busy people and they don't have a lot of time and they need things to be explicitly spelled out for them. So one of the tricks I use, for example, is that when I respond to a grant, a call for grant applications, the first thing I do when I've decided to apply is I go through the entire call with a yellow highlighter, and I highlight all the catchphrases. And if they refer to white papers or policy briefs, I go through those, and I also highlight all the catchphrases. And then I make sure that I reflect them back in my applications and that I use the same terminology and the same trendy catchphrases that are the words of the moment. And that helps me to frame and tag the right pieces of my application that the reviewers want to see. But the other thing I've learned is that the other thing I do is I try and have a champion on the grant with me who is maybe a really well-recognized name in that field. And I think that does help. And yeah, I also just put on a really thick skin and I expect to be rejected and I expect to also have reviews that often feel very unfair. So I try not to take them on personally and I try and learn from those experiences and just move forward. So I can share with you a recent example of an application I put in. It was an epidemiological basis for the analysis, and I had two very eminent epidemiologists who had agreed to be on my advisory panel. And the comment I got back was that it would be nice to have an epidemiologist on my advisory panel. And it's very frustrating because there's no space for recourse. You can't write back and say, hey, but I had two epidemiologists, didn't you see them? You just have to take it on the chin and move on. So I think it's really important to just put on your thick skin and expect to fail a lot. And also be aware that the ones that succeed are not necessarily the ones that you thought would succeed. And the ones that fail are not necessarily the ones that you would expect to fail. And you have to just keep trucking. It's a marathon. I mean, there are all these sort of numbers bandied around about the success rate, but I think, the one I've heard is that 1 in 8 applications are successful, and I think that's probably fairly realistic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to be realistic with these things. And so, Jennifer, in your, obviously in your experience, you've talked about how do you usually identify groups whom you think are best placed to deliver, and then you fund them. Do you feel this is an effective way of having the impact that you want?
It's definitely an effective way of achieving our very focused impact. As I said, we're a very strategy-oriented organization. We know what our North Star goal is. We know the steps that we need to take as, in my case, the malaria community to get there. So by finding those teams that we think really are best positioned, and typically those will be teams that are in country, they're near to the problem. They're often teams with, real lived experience in the malaria space, and they tend to be very interdisciplinary teams as well, too. But the targeted approach does work. That being said, we do also have another program within the Gates Foundation that I love because it's our way of finding new folks to add to our network of potential partners and grantees. And that's a Grand Challenges Explorations program. And I think it fills a really interesting niche in the funding space because sometimes you just have a cool idea and you need to be able to demonstrate, proof of concept. Yeah, this can work. And you don't need, $1 million budget or a $5 million budget. Just something simple like $50,000, $100,000 would do. So what the Grand Challenges Exploration program allows us at the foundation to do is just put out an open call for proposals. Sometimes it's completely broad. It's just, send us your best ideas in global health. Other times it might be a little more focused. We ran one recently on deploying genetic and genomic approaches for malaria surveillance in malaria endemic countries and show us a collaborative project done with the National Malaria Control Program. And those are small, totally open award competitions, but they really serve to, say, kind of shake the tree and help us find new potential partners, diversify that base of researchers, implementers, scientists that we grant to. So although we are targeted, we are also at the same time always looking for new voices in this space to ensure that we can be inclusive going forward.
Yeah, I like that actually. I like that model because, when I was sort of still starting out and wanting to do my independent research, I actually would struggle to get funding. And I mean, my dream was like, even if I could just get somebody to give, to fund me just even 20,000 or whatever, I don't need $1 million just to get started. I think a lot of researchers are sometimes just looking for a break to work on their idea, to get themselves established, and then they can move forward. And yet, most of the grants that maybe they are seeing or available are the big grants, which they don't need. It's not that, they don't even necessarily want to have access to they don't need that kind of level of funding. So I think that Grand Challenges is really a great program. And I'm sure a lot of people have benefited from that. Moving on to, this interesting part, which is the grants funding for research and so forth as a major source of frustration, so let's talk about that. And I just want to hear from you, Nicki. So what are some of the major frustrations that researchers go through, particularly around funding, even at the institutional level, in terms of, requirements by the institutions, scientific output, and all that stuff. We all know that because it is so stressful, like Jennifer mentioned at the beginning, it's so stressful trying to catch up, trying to apply for grant. It's really stressful, and it can also cause a lot of mental health problems because people are not able to rest. They're not able to sleep because they have to stay up the whole night to write a grant, which gets rejected. And then they have to, try again and develop that thick skin. So I just wanted to hear from you. What are some of those frustrations that, researchers go through, and how to overcome them?
I think it's a great question, Alice. And I wish that someone had sat me down at the beginning of my academic career and explained what I was getting into, because I think I might have thought twice, because it is very, very stressful. So my new position coming up that I'm moving to in October is the first time as a researcher that I will have a permanent position. And I'm, very well published. I'm going into a professorship, so I'm currently an associate professor. I've been around the block and I've done what's been required, but this will be my first opportunity to actually not worry about what I'm going to do when my salary runs out. So, I think if you're going to go into research and you're going to go into this funding process, it's very important to accept that you're going in for a long game. It's not going to get fixed quickly. And you need to be comfortable with that when you get going, because you don't want to discover it halfway along the way and be totally devastated that it's not easy. So it's very important to be aware of what you're getting into. And then the other point that I would make is that it's really important to play the game by the rules. The rules are you need to publish, you need to give talks and be present, and you need to network. So if you're not prepared to do those things, you may really struggle to get ahead when it comes to applying for funding. So to make this happen, it means having a good mentor, and that mentor needs to be willing to support you to fly and to become independent. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point to also be aware that not all mentors are that willing to let go of their excellent junior scientists, because it's really great if you've trained someone up to write grants very well and to supervise students very well, to have that person working on your projects. And not all senior scientists really want to see those expert people launch independently. And this sounds very cynical, but it's something to be aware of, that is, if your mentor is not pushing you to become independent in your own right, you're going to really struggle to make it to that next step. So it's important to bring all the building blocks together, make sure you're publishing, make sure you have a mentor who's allowing you to be a first name author, and when appropriate to progress to more senior authorships, that they're helping you write grants, but they're respecting that you're writing grants to do your own work, not writing their grants for them to do work. I think these are all building blocks that can help you manage the stresses as you go. You can start off, it's actually great to be a ghostwriter on a senior person's grant for a while, because you learn a lot of skills and you can learn how to put together the applications and how these things function, and you might be able to put in some salary for yourself to be part of that project if the PI agrees. So there's a lot to be gained from being that person initially, but you've got to be able to then make the break when the time is right and start doing those things for yourself. And I think I see a lot of people who hit a ceiling in research because it's very hard to go from being the right-hand person to being the person. And it's not necessarily a transition that the person always wants to support. And, the people at the top in science can see you also particularly if you're doing well, as a potential threat in their field. It sounds childish, but it happens. So it's very important to be aware of the potential pitfalls and to be very strategic about how you bring together the pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I mean, I think a lot of people can relate to situations where they feel that they might be ready to actually step up, but their mentor or supervisors are not ready. And or situations where you feel that you've put in a lot of work, you've written the grant, and then unless you put your head of department as the PI, you cannot submit it. And I mean, there's situations where I remember, I think times where I would be told, if you do not put so-and-so on that grant, you're not going to get that funding. And it's probably true, it's probably not. I mean, it's difficult to tell because I didn't do the grant writing for too long. But it's really sad that that's what happens. So it's like, let's put this person on this grant because then only then our grant will be considered, or we have a higher chance of receiving that. I just want to hear from Jennifer what you think about that. The fact that, it's more like putting people's names on grants because that will increase the chance of it being funded, even if they didn't actually write anything.
Oh, it's horrifying. And the same thing plays out in academic publications as well. Sometimes it's putting an author's name on because it's a big name, even though they contributed very little. And, I think one of the solutions to that, and this is something that we do at the Gates Foundation, is we don't have a personnel section on the grant. I think most people, when they're used to filling out a grant application, are familiar with the fact that they're going to have to put a proposal together, they're going to have to put a budget together, and then they're going to have to collect CVs or bio sketches, some description of everybody on the team. And I think anybody that's done a large grant application will tell you that is the biggest pain in the butt when it comes to doing the application, is just collecting all of that, all of the CVs, all of the personal information. At the foundation, we don't do that. We fund based on the idea, and we are working with you as a potential grantee because we know you are best positioned to do the work. We are going specifically to you and your team. So we don't ask for CVs. We don't ask for a list of team members. I mean, if they are going to be funded out of the grant salary-wise, their names will have to go in the budget template, but we're not asking for any information. No publication record, no H-index, no bio sketch, no nothing. We really do fund based on the quality of the idea itself. And I think that's something that more and more funders should be exploring, even those that do the more traditional open calls for funding. So, for example, in Canada with the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, the community was generally, a few years ago, rewind 5-6 years ago, the community is quite unhappy with the fact that more sort of mid or later career researchers were earning the lion's share of grant money because they just had stronger personnel and background sections on their grants. So what CHR decided to do was split their general open pool of money into two, and they call one stream the project stream and the other stream is the foundation stream. The foundation is meant to fund people based on the strength of their previous academic research track records. So you sort of write a loose research plan for the coming years, but your funding is being awarded based on the strength of what you've done before. So those tend to go to the more senior researchers with those established track records. The project scheme, on the other hand, the weighting when the reviewers are going through and scoring each application, the person and the team behind the work is weighted much, much, much less than just the quality of the proposal itself. So that stream is really focused on funding ideas and not people. So it is a huge problem, but we're starting to see funders pay more attention to fixing it through changing the process itself.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess changing the culture is a big thing these days, the research environment. And so I'm just curious to know, what does success look like? So when do you feel, like in your role, especially Jennifer, when do you feel like this has been a very successful project, or you could give us an example of when you felt that this went really well?
Yeah, we're actually very focused on success right from the moment we start crafting grant proposals with our potential partner. We do something at the foundation that we describe as outcome-based investing. And so we start with the outcomes. We start with what is the change that we want to see in the system as a result of this project happening? That is the very first thing we get our teams to articulate. And then from there, they work backwards. They say, okay, if we want this ultimate outcome, What are the kind of intermediate steps along the way, the intermediate outcomes that will get us there? And what are the activities? What do we specifically need to do, in the lab, in the field, et cetera, in order to achieve those steps along the way and get to that ultimate outcome? So it's almost like we build a grant backwards. Traditionally in academia, you start from okay, here's the question I'm interested in. Here are the tools that my lab specializes in. Here's what we have at our disposal that we'll use to attack this problem. Here's how we're going to approach it step by step. And then only at the very end of your grant application do you come up with okay, what's the big so what? The big, what's this problem going to solve and what transformative impact will it have in the world? But at the foundation, like I said, we do it completely opposite. We start with that outcome. We start with the change and we figure out what actual activities, what step-by-step, methods need to be included in a grant to get us there. So it's a very different way of approaching developing an application, but it's a way that best positions a project for success because that outcome is the very first thing you define, and everything you put in your proposal speaks to getting you to that outcome. And what are the indicators that you need to track along the way to ensure you're making progress towards that success? So it's going to be different for every project. Some of our projects, it might be something as big as, reduced malaria burden in a particular region over a 3-year time frame. Other times, success is looking like, landscaping effort and understanding more about the lay of the land in a particular region. It can vary from grant to grant, but as long as you start with what is that transformative change we want this project to lead to and build your proposal towards that, I think that's one of the things that will keep you on track to a successful outcome.
Wow. And I guess it's really, you start with the end in mind and then focus on that, which is really good. And in terms of as somebody who is applying for a lot of grants, Nicki, what has been your sort of your proudest moment where you felt this was a really good program, this was a really good project, I got the funding, I used it as I should have, and we made the impact that we intended? Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, I can. So quite a few of the grants that I've been working on they've been large consortia grants, or they've been part of a larger project. So I haven't necessarily been a PI on those grants that we've delivered on, but I think, the bioinformatics network, the H3 Africa Bioinformatics Network, has really raised the profile of bioinformatics. The PI of that is Nikki Mulder at UCT, and I've been part of that from when we wrote the first application 10 years ago or 9 years ago. So I think that that's had a really large impact in terms of capacitating African researchers to do really great human genomics research. So I think that one has been an ongoing grant that's been really great to be part of. I actually have a nice grant that's been put on hold during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was completely the opposite end of the spectrum, in that it was a small grant. It was for a pilot study, and it was a very well-packaged, short, tidy, and very satisfying application to put together. It was a very clean application. So that's looking at the other end of the spectrum. And I guess it's a reminder that you don't always have to aim huge. You can get satisfaction from the smaller grants. And that one, we've had to hold off implementing the main part of the grant. So we're putting the building blocks in place. We obviously haven't been able to go and collect samples during the pandemic, but it's a very well-designed pilot that is going to really set the scene for bigger work going forward. So that one also has felt like a very satisfying outcome to have that funded and to be able to take it forward. So I don't think the size of the grant or the number of collaborators is really what matters. I think it's just really nice when you actually put together a good, solid application and it gets recognized for that and actually gets funded. It's quite exciting. Yeah, and I think, to make these things work, I think going forward, it's really important to realize that that's not going to be a common occurrence and to be ready to deal with that. Yeah.
You can do a lot with very little. I always even refer back to some of the work that I've done because you're forced to think a lot more I guess more strategically, because you actually have very little money to do what you need to do and still produce something, so you can publish something and then get more funding. So sometimes you actually get a whole lot more done when you have very little, and it gives a lot of satisfaction. So, with all this, the most topical issue at the moment, fairness and equity and so forth, how can institutions or funding organizations, how can we keep promoting? So everybody wants to promote diversity. Everybody's talking about how can we have more women as PIs? How can we support more early career researchers? How can we have people from other ethnic groups, being PIs and so forth? How do you see this, Jennifer? What are you doing in your area in terms of really promoting the diversity that we need? Because you know that some researchers always tend to feel like they never get grants and other people are always getting. So they're always a group of people that they feel, how come they always get the grant and they never get the grant? So how can we deal with this? How can we change this? How can we change that image and obviously the culture around promoting others in getting research grants?
Yeah, I think funders need to be honest with themselves and realize that we could all be doing a better job, and then be very intentional about implementing an equity lens to your funding opportunities. It's not enough to be, equal and promoting equality and open competitions. It has to be based in equity. It has to be based in targeting groups that are underrepresented in the research enterprise with specific opportunities just for them. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the grand challenges that we recently ran in malaria molecular surveillance. All of those awards went to malaria endemic country scientists. That was one of the criteria for application. You had to be an endemic country scientist submitting the application. We weren't going to be funding, a group in the United States or the United Kingdom or Europe who are partnering with an LMIC. We wanted to fund the LMIC researchers directly. So you do have to create those specific opportunities. And when you do, if you are a funder that runs more traditional open competitions, I think you really need to set and meet specific targets, saying, at least 50% of the funding will go to female PIs or to early career investigators. You have to set yourself those targets and you have to hold yourself accountable to them. I think we can also, as a global community, strengthen lower and middle income countries, whoever their donors are. If it's, a national science institute there, we need to be strengthening their ability to fund work happening in their own countries so that they can be receiving and reviewing proposals in a researcher's native language. They can be funding researchers that are working in those country institutions. So I think there is a role for more global participation in this space too. For example, BMGF, we're a global health organization. We fund all over the world. And we need more big international global organizations whose funding competitions don't have geography or citizenship restriction. I think one of the other things that funders need to do is be very intentional about avoiding parachute science. When you see an application come in that is, a group of researchers based at, let's say, a United States university who are partnering with, let's use the example of a malaria endemic country, but the majority of the award, the majority of the personnel, it's flowing to the U.S. institution. Just don't let those happen anymore. Be very intentional about calling them out, saying we're not funding things like this, and telling the submitting institution, this is why we're not funding it. It's because this isn't really truly a partnership with your LMIC partner organization. So one of the things we've taken to doing at the foundation is when we do see a good partnership between, say, an institute in North America and one in Sub-Saharan Africa, we'll actually issue two separate awards. There's two discrete investments, one in the North American team, one in the team based in Africa. each funding pot flows to that own specific institution, and it's a way of just sort of leveling the equity playing field. And to what I said earlier, I think, funding based on ideas, funding based on the strength of the project and not the CVs of the people behind it is another one of those things that we can do to help raise the voices of whether it's a woman, an early career investigator, a scientist working in a lower and middle income country. There's a lot of things we can do. It just requires funders and donors to really commit to doing those things.
Wow. I'm glad to hear that, because actually that's something that, I really wanted you to cover in terms of how do we level that playing field, and to see our funders actually thinking about this more critically, making a deliberate effort to do this or to change, the image that is currently there is really going to make a difference. And I have to admit that, sometimes it's thinking about the confidence that it gives to those people when they are, when they feel responsible for their own grants, when they feel responsible for their funding and their research. And I think it is time that, that is definitely looked at more clearly. And from institutions, Nicki, what do you think institutions should be doing, or at least in your case, you've been working a lot in the universities to improve, at least to promote all that, diversity?
So I think one of the things that I've found an avenue that I can use to try and push for diversity and equity in general practices is that I've been involved, and I am involved in quite a few consortia working groups. It's kind of unpaid labor because you do a lot of work for the working groups, for different consortia, research consortia. But it's also a place where you can have a voice from your institution, from your background, from your experience and your community to talk about problems as they come up. So I do recommend getting involved in these kind of working groups that are set up, because that's where you can represent your part of the world and your demographic that maybe is underrepresented. So I certainly think that's a space where it's possible to make some changes if you're willing to, have a voice and get out there and do a bit of unpaid labor, which a lot of research is. Yeah. My unfortunate experience has been that it isn't a level playing field. And I'm very, very cautious about who I collaborate with for that reason. I think it's important just to have your eyes open, who you work with, what the conditions are. And I think it's also important to ask for representation and to be willing to stand up and say, well, I don't think that's particularly fair. Of course, it's easier to say that from a higher up position in the ladder, and it's very hard to do that as a junior scientist. And sometimes you just have to suck it in and know that it's actually not very fair, but try and use it to leverage to take your next steps. So try and avoid being locked into it, for the rest of your career. So when you do make the compromise, at least be conscious of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and make sure that you're making a deliberate decision to perhaps accept that it's not perfect and that you change it if you could. As I started saying, at the beginning of the podcast, a lot of my decisions have had to be pragmatic decisions, and that is the reality, that we do have to sometimes be pragmatic. And it's about making the call when you're not prepared to compromise on something, and then you have to be willing to stand up for it. But I think, a lot of institutions, certainly in South Africa, have been much more sensitized, of course, because of the history here, to inequity. And I realize it's a slow process to change things. But if we all help to push the ship slightly, eventually the Titanic can kind of change course. I think also as you get more senior, it's important you can make sure that you support the people coming up behind you in a more equitable way and give them the opportunities, even if you didn't have them yourself. So it's always important to be looking who's coming behind you and how can you make sure that they don't have the same negative experiences that you have. So I think that's the responsibility for all of us who do manage to somehow bash through some of the barriers and claw our way up to a more stable position, is to make sure we're carrying as many people there that we can along the way.
Oh, yeah, that's good to hear, actually. And so in the spirit of our pay it forward motto of this podcast, so, pay it forward. And, if there are people that are behind you who are coming with you, take them with you and show them the way, signpost them the right way. It has to be collective effort, and, hopefully things will change. So we're just coming to the end of our recording. I'm just going to ask you to give any final words, tips and tricks, and, just to build upon for researchers to stay motivated. Maybe one or two from you, Jennifer, first.
Sure. I think, my favorite tip for staying motivated and cultivating what will be a really fulsome research career is just to always be following your curiosity, whatever it is, even if it doesn't seem immediately related to the specific domain of science that you're working in. If you're excited by it and interested in it, follow up on it, collect all of those different perspectives. You'll often find, 5, 10, 15 years from now, when you look back on, you find yourself in an interesting place in your career and go, gosh, I wonder how I got here. You look back and you realize that it was never a straight line journey. It was always a winding path. And it was that collected suite of diverse experiences, that mosaic that really uniquely positioned you to be in that amazing place that you're going to be many years from now. So follow your curiosity.
Nice. And Nicki?
So I agree with Jennifer, absolutely. But as with the tone of everything I've said, I'm quite pragmatic in my approach. So I would add to that is I think it's really important to be prepared that it's hard, and also to be prepared. And this was quite a shock for me, actually. I sort of assumed, because I was so enthralled with science and I had this sort of strong code of how things would happen in academia, I was quite shocked to meet some really not very nice people who had made it to the top. And I wasn't expecting that. I sort of thought there would be pure intentions and, people would just be enthralled by the science, and that was it. So I did realize in academia, like any other industry or sector, that there are also people who are not necessarily, gunning for you in a good way, and that they maybe not, don't have your best interests at heart. So I guess I'm saying make sure in your toolkit that you have the tools to be discerning and to select who you work with quite carefully and with some thought. And don't anticipate that everybody's going to be pushing you upwards with the same enthusiasm. And you can often help, to do that by speaking to people who work with senior colleagues. So maybe if you're thinking of joining a lab or a group, speak to the postdocs who are already in that group. Find out what it's like, find out if they're being properly mentored and pushed forward. I think it's really important to be selective about who you work with and to get you forward. And I certainly know that my progress, where I've managed to make progress, has really been very dependent on having people who have kind of had my back, senior people who've been willing to mentor me and help me get to the next level. And I definitely couldn't have done it without those people supporting me. So I think that's really important. And then I guess speaking also similar to what Jennifer said in terms of being flexible, I would say in your mind, always have a backup plan. So if you've chosen a particular route that you want to take and it's not panning out, have some alternatives, that you're also willing to pursue so that you're not caught completely short. And my experience of doing an MPH and having the epidemiology qualification to use when I needed to shift sideways is a great example of having a backup plan, saying, okay, they're not great opportunities where I want to go, so let me make sure that I have some other paths if I need to follow them. And then I think really a very, very important one to help you get forward is just to say, don't take it personally. So when the reviews are really rubbish, don't take it personally. When your paper's rejected, don't take it personally. It's happening to everyone. It's hard. It doesn't mean that necessarily you're a terrible scientist or a terrible person. It just means that that's part of the process. So really put on a thick skin, keep going, stick to your own process and do the best you can, but don't let it take you down as an individual either as you chart your course.
So there we have it. It reminds me of an episode we had last year where one of the guests said, life is hard. Be pragmatic, be flexible, always be ready to look out for opportunities and keep going. So thank you both for joining us. I'm going to ask you if you could share with our listeners where they can find you on Twitter or LinkedIn, just starting with Jennifer.
I'm at Jennifer Gardy. That's JenniferGardy. And you can find me on Twitter.
And Nicki?
I'm not very active on Twitter, so if you want to connect with me, probably best through LinkedIn or ResearchGate. I do have a profile there too.
Well, thank you. And for our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Please follow us on Twitter at mentor_podcast. I'll repeat that, at mentor_podcast, where we'll let you know when new episodes are released. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud just by searching Your Digital Mentor Podcast. You can also reach us by email, so please send your comments and questions to inquiries@yourdigimentor.net. So again, inquiries@yourdigimentor.net. And as always, information on the episode and how to reach us will be in the description box, including how to connect with our guests and also links to more information and resources. Finally, our goal is for the podcast to be shared as a resource. So please remember to tell people about us. And thanks again, and see you in 2 weeks.
This episode is supported by Advanced Courses in Scientific Conferences, a program which develops and delivers training and conferences that span basic research,